9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm David Rothkopf, your host, and this is the second of a two-part discussion that we're having on the major events in Syria and what they have to do with us here in the U.S. and the region. And fortunately today we have two experts who are also friends and two of the best people I can imagine to talk to about this. One, the host of our very own Above Average Intelligence podcast, former CIA go-to-it guy, Marc Polymeropoulos. How are you doing, Marc?
I'm doing great and very pleased the Red Sox are moving in free agency and trades and everything. The winter meetings are rocking. Let's go.
Yeah, that's what we're here to talk about, Marc. We'll just move straight on to our other guest, Charles Lister, who is a senior fellow and the director of the Syria and Countering Terrorism and Extremism programs at the Middle East Institute. His work focuses on all things Syria and on issues of terrorism and insurgency across the Levant. If you don't follow him and you want to understand what's going on in this, as soon as we're off, go to Blue Sky. Don't go to the other place. Go to Blue Sky and follow Charles. How are you doing, Charles?
I'm doing good. It's been a dizzying couple of weeks, but I'm glad I could make the time to do this and rejoin you guys. So thanks for having me.
Well, we're really glad to. Your threads, your comments have been really kind of the source of light in the midst of a lot of chaos and confusion. And I think I'd like to start there just to get your reaction to where we are. It's, as we're recording this, it's on a Thursday. We're a few days into this thing. What do you know today that you didn't know when it all started?
Gosh, great question. Well, I mean, yeah, things are moving at a very fast pace inside Syria. Of course, on the one hand, Syrians are still jubilant and euphoric at their newfound freedom. I think it bears remembering that it's been nearly 54 years of Assad family tyrannical rule in Syria. So for the vast majority of Syrians still alive today, this is a completely brand new experience. Being able to be out on the streets, talking about politics, speaking with the foreign journalists on the ground, talking about the future of Syria is a really new experience. What do we know so there's a transition going on the ground. I think for most, it's not necessarily the kind of transition we would have originally envisaged if we had drawn it up on a piece of paper 6 months ago. But that transition's moving at 100 miles an hour. There was a UN plan to try to design and move forward a Syria transition in Geneva. But that seems to have slowed down, if not died a sudden death over the last couple of days, simply because of how fast things are moving on the ground. And so as a result of that, a lot of the international community behind the scenes has intensively sought to negotiate or to engage. Or
to bomb.
Yes, I'll come to that bit in a minute.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, diplomatically, most Arab states, several European states, and indirectly the United States have now sought out and engaged with this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is running this transitional body in Damascus. We're all doing that for one reason, which is to establish relationships that we didn't have before and to try and guide the process that is already underway in more encouraging directions. So there's a race on the ground. The Turks are on the ground today. The Qataris on the ground. The Italians were meeting them yesterday. But yes, meanwhile, the Israelis have taken significant military actions, which, quite frankly, are escalating things in a way that are potentially concerning in the long term. And there's big fighting in the northeast. And our SDF partners right now, I think, are in an existential position, which, has a knock-on effect in terms of whether or not US troops will be able to stay in Syria. It raises the very significant question as to whether or not ISIS will resurge in the future. And frankly, it already is. So there's, big and unanswered questions here and huge challenges from the perspective of the US and our allies and partners.
Okay, well, we will come back to all of this. Before I get to Mark, though, let me, ask one of those questions that's, more akin to what you get on a cable news show. But as of this moment, a lot of the people I know who've studied Syria are like, yes, we should be cautious, but what has happened in Syria with the end of this regime should also be celebrated. And we should take a moment to celebrate it and then move into our caution. So on the cautious optimism meter, where are you right now?
It's a good question. So, well, I mean, I'm euphoric to see all my Syrian friends feeling freedom for the first time for most of them in their lives. But yes, I'm cautious about what comes next. Everything is up in the air. And as I say, this transition's being run by what is still a designated terrorist organization. Now, this is a movement that's changed a great deal, but still brings with it plenty of its own challenges. It's still very autocratic and dictatorial, or certainly has been. And so I'm pretty cautious about how this transition is going to go. They've given themselves 3 months as what they're called a caretaker government until March 2025. Those next 3 months are going to determine to what extent the rest of Syria's society, its minority communities, different ethnic groups are going to be able to be integrated into that transition. And that's going to be an enormous challenge. And if it doesn't work, then there is a real risk we're entering into a new period of conflict and instability, in which, again, geopolitics is going to come to dictate, how that plays out and where it goes next. So we're in a very, very, very delicate stage. So, yeah, cautious for sure. Concerned, yes. But the euphoria, for now, seems to be pulling all of the many, diverse groups of Syria together. And I think we just have to hope that with support and encouragement from the outside, we can push this and guide it in the right kind of directions and dissuade all of the bad tendencies that could threaten to pull it all apart before it really gets started.
Good. Now I'd like to turn to Mark, but I'd like to wait a second here. Riley, Charles broke up 3 times in the middle of that. Are you getting Charles's comments? Okay, good. All right, so I'll pick up in 3 seconds. Okay, so Marc, you've spent a lot of time in and around this region studying these people, and we're no doubt as surprised by the speed of this change as anybody else was. What's your take? What's your response to Charles's take?
So, well, first of all, it's good to be on with Charles, who, I've had on my podcast talking about Syria before. And of course, I call him often on this. This is Charles's Super Bowl right now. And I mean that seriously. Charles has been working on this. We kind of come and go on the Syria issue, and Charles is the one who's stayed on it. So it's awesome to be on here. You use the term, euphoria, and that's right. I mean, I lived in Syria. Now, it's been some time. It is without a doubt, when you go and you talk to Near East hands, Middle East hands across the U.S. government, whether the intelligence community, the diplomatic corps, the military attaches, it is to a T the most. It's the favorite posting that many of us had, including myself. I lived there for 3 years, and it's not because of the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which you get a firsthand look on the pervasive fear in the police state. It was a hideous regime, but it's the Syrian people who were extraordinary. And, I made great friends there. The friends have, look, I'm a public persona, former CIA officer. They're calling me from Syria. They probably shouldn't be, but it's because they literally would just say, I'm so happy right now. Because again, after, knowing Syrians, having lived there, the idea that this police state fell is just extraordinary. So I do like the idea, and Charles said it, and David, you said it, others have said it too, is take a moment and just understand, like, we can't have that notion that, Bashar was the devil we know. We can't look back to it to say that, perhaps the regime, if it had stayed, would be better off for U.S. That just can't be part of the conversation. And in some areas, it is. You get some of the kind of some of the foreign policy crowd in the U.S. is, was kind of saying, well, we're going to lament the day that this happened. No, we're not. I mean, I hope things turn out well. But for God's sakes, what the Syrians have lived through. So it is kind of a joyous time. And I fall back on that when you do think about kind of what's going to be messy ahead. and it is going to be messy. So I guess my comment, and I don't want to repeat all the things that Charles said as well, that to have a bit of a different take on this is, are there things we can do as I'm not going to use expletives here, as we've screwed up Iraq and Libya and other places? Are there things that we can do differently in Syria that ensure a more favorable outcome? And I think that, one of the things that I saw was from the U.S. administration. Charles and I were at the Atlantic Council yesterday, and Charles, I don't think you were there for the head of counterterrorism for the State Department was there. And what she was saying, and I agree in some sense, you have to engage. What we don't have to do, what we should not do, is what incoming President Donald Trump said on True Social is, we should have nothing to do with this. That's insane. We have to engage because there are core interests there. There's the counter-ISIS mission. There are potentially floating chemical weapons around. The Israelis certainly are trying to take care of that, but that is an issue. We have to obviously, encourage this, a transitional government that respects minorities. And there's also the notion, I think, that you have to ensure that whatever entity comes does not allow Iran to ever continue sending shipments of weapons through Syria to Hezbollah. Syria was just this key logistics hub. So there are really core U.S. interests there. And so the idea of engagement in some fashion, understanding that HTS is an FTO, a designated terrorist organization. Look, I think that this is a perfect job for my old outfit, who we talk to, bad people sometimes and can be a good conduit behind the scenes. But we have to engage. And the last part about I think last comment too, and Charles mentioned it, is that, I laugh because the Turkish foreign minister just arrived in Damascus, Fidan, who used to be their intel chief, who was an integral part of the previous program to try to overthrow the Bashar regime. And so that's just a kind of another reflection of kind of the great power competition, and the regional states certainly will be quite involved. And don't forget that, particularly amongst some of the Gulf states, Jordan as well, there was a push. The U.S. was kind of lukewarm, maybe even going to accede to, of normalization with Assad, which ends up being spectacularly, off. Really, I guess I would say messy times. Am I cautiously optimistic? I don't know. As an intelligence officer, I think the easiest thing to do, the smartest thing to do, is say it depends. It depends on a lot of factors. So you have euphoria, sure, a messy situation now, but boy, I would be very, very concerned in a month when the Trump administration takes over, if they don't pursue some policy of engagement and just leave it to the region, because we do have kind of core interest there. And as Charles noted, last part on the CT counterterrorism issue, my old kind of bailiwick, there is not only an ISIS presence there's a resurgence of ISIS, and that is a big deal for the United States. And then, of course, 900 U.S. forces there that are present in country.
Charles, when I look back at U.S. policy in the Middle East over the course of, say, just the past quarter century, all I see is mistakes. Literally, you go from Bush and Iraq to Obama and not doing what he should have done in Syria to Trump and getting hung up with the wrong people and playing footsie with the Russians, to Biden, and we have Afghanistan and Gaza and so on and so forth. I think both of you have said, well, the U.S. needs to do X, Y, Z. What is there to lead us to believe that we can do anything to make a difference, particularly given this kind of new great game that has shifted over perhaps from Afghanistan to Syria for the moment? And what makes you think perhaps that our influence will be limited?
If I can kick off, I think the US doesn't hold the keys to fix whatever comes next in Syria. So it's not our job alone, but we do have a role to play, and we do have significant leverage. On the one hand, we have held the Syrian economy by the neck for the last 13 plus years. Now, most of those sanctions that were having that effect were designed to be in place because of the regime. So now that the regime is out of the way, in theory, we have the keys alongside the European Union to really open up the Syrian economy to investment. It's not a coincidence that Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, the leader of HTS that's pushing forward this transition, has made a point, and I think every single one of his recent interviews with English-speaking media, to use the words reconstruction and rebuilding. He is clearly sending the message that, the banks need to open up and the sanctions need to be dropped so that Syria can start to recover. So we have that area of leverage. I think we also have a particular area of leverage, which is that HTS, this group, remains a designated terrorist organization. And now nobody's really been paying much attention to this group for a long time, but it's an open secret that for the last 3 or 4 years, Jolani himself has been personally sending messages towards the United States to say, we want to be a security partner, we want to assist in your counterterrorism efforts, because they've been fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda for several years. And he is desperate to lose that designation. And that gives us a huge bit of leverage here. They have been very well behaved over the last couple of weeks. And if we want to see that sustained, I think we have the greatest area of leverage to keep that going, because we hold that key. So it's tricky, it's complicated, it's certainly messy, and most of this won't play out in public. But we do have the opportunity here to guide things in the right directions very early on. And then just lastly, not to make things more complicated, but I think I mentioned just a minute ago that the situation in the northeast of the country where we have troops is getting very, very messy by the hour.
And the origin of that is Turkey's fear of the Kurds, or Turkey's ambitions with regard to the Kurds? Is that the issue?
Well, certainly that's one of the triggers, yes. I mean, for the first time in the Syrian crisis, Turkey has a completely open door to do whatever it wants vis-a-vis the PYD-YPG Kurdish faction, which it sees as a terrorist organization. Prior to recent developments, both the Syrian government and Russia essentially had to greenlight anything that the Turks tried to do in the northeast of the country. Now, they don't have those handcuffs on anymore. But at the same time, an important new dynamic has taken root, which is the SDF, our partners on the ground. They're an umbrella force. They're led primarily and guided by this Kurdish majority faction, but they also incorporate significant numbers of Arab tribes, former opposition groups that were fighting the regime. It's been a marriage of convenience, the SDF, for the last several years. But given the huge developments we've seen in the defeat of the regime, these Arab tribes and former opposition groups have suddenly realized that they can reattach themselves to the kind of revolutionary brand again. So in Deir ez-Zor, the eastern province, as well as Raqqa in the north, we've seen all of these communities and groups peel away from the SDF. Most of them have basically defected. So now we're seeing the green revolutionary flag that's being hoisted in Damascus flying from public buildings in Raqqa under SDF control and in Deir ez-Zor. If the SDF lose the Arab components, the SDF becomes a Kurdish militia again. All the more reason for the Turks to see that as a threat. And so that's why we're seeing significant violence breaking out throughout SDF-held territories. And for us as the US, that is a huge challenge, potentially existentially, to our troop deployment and our ability to continue to combat ISIS. So there's really big stakes here. But as with everything in Syria, it's very, very complicated with no easy solutions.
Well, Marc, this to me is one of the most striking aspects of all this. And frankly, the average American sitting at home who goes, well, this is far away, and, I don't know how this connects with us. I don't think we've seen in recent memory a situation that has so quickly involved so many actors of such importance in the world taking action in ways that are not coordinated with one another and could bring them into conflict with one another. And so just to go down the list, you have the Turks in the Northeast. You have the Turks seeing this as their opening versus Iran. You have Iran having suffered a setback with Hamas and Hezbollah, and now here dramatically weaker, much weaker than we ever imagined possible than they were just a couple of months ago. You have the Israelis going in, increasing their buffer zone, tanks within kilometers of Damascus, bombing north of Damascus, being involved. We have all those foreign ministers coming in. Meanwhile, the Russians, who were unable to protect Assad, have apparently been able to say, well, no, we're going to keep our bases here. So and so far they're being able to keep their bases there. And that's why I referred to it earlier as the new great game. Everybody is in this. Does that worry you? I mean, it's a real echo to me of kind of post-colonialism, but a real colonial mindset. All the big powers are like, yeah, never mind Syrian independence. We've got our own agendas here.
And I think you not just by default of time, you missed other key states like Jordan, who actually, I think King Abdullah is looking at this in a variety of ways, but mostly saying, wait a second, I might have an Islamist takeover right next door. And so some of these countries will think of their own internal stability issues. I had Syrian friends, like I have any influence in this, calling me saying, like, can you get the Israelis to stop bombing? Now, of course, I just pick up my hotline to
Bibi.
I speak with several times a day, and I said sure, but but you're right in the sense of lots of different actors, certainly pushing forward their own agendas, and so what happens on things like this is at some point people start getting together, and perhaps it's under the notion of pushing for this transitional government. But we are going to have to start talking to our partners. Now, Secretary Blinken is in the region, not only kind of discussing a potential hostage deal, but I believe he's going to Jordan and Turkey as well. And Jake Sullivan is in the region too. So I think the U.S. Probably will have designs to try to get some kind of consensus on this. The Russians are really the interesting point, and I'm interested in what Charles says too. And certainly it's not my old job of running sources anymore, but a lot of the information I keep hearing is that somehow there's been some deal cut with the Russians from HTS in terms of the bases are still there. I'm not and I spent my entire career trying to push the Russians out of the Middle East, out of Syria, only have. And look, I was a fan of President Obama. Syria policy was a disaster, and we essentially invited the Russians back in, which still to this day I think a lot of us are bitter about. But the idea that the Russians may be totally pushed out as well, that might be a bit fanciful. They desperately want those naval bases for their power projection, and so I'm not entirely sure that HTS has not cut some kind of deal with them, but that remains to be seen. So you're right, a lot of competing, a lot of players with competing agendas. Is it a concern? Sure, but I think there will be some, specifically the United States and with our Arab partners in Turkey. There's got to be some kind of consensus on how this moves forward, and I think you'll see a lot of diplomacy in the region again with Sullivan and Blinken, either there now or en route.
Well, I want to get to that in a second. This is the point in the podcast where we say to all of you who are not members, we're really grateful that you joined us. We've got a bunch more of the podcast to go, about a third more. And that's for paying members. So, this will be a good time to go to the dsrnetwork.com and click on membership and become a member, which is, the same as the price of a Substack or something like that. But it helps us do what we're doing. And then you get to hear all the bonus content in all of our shows, and all the paywalls that were off or down during the election are coming back up. So this is a great time to take action on that. For now, thanks to all of you who are not members, and for all of you who are members, stand by. So Charles, I'd be interested in your reaction to the same question I just posed to Marc, but more broadly, I don't recall a moment prior to maybe 2011, since the Arab Spring, where there seemed to the region seemed to be in such flux, and how this works out could have a big impact on all of that. And Israel thinks it has an upper hand. The Gulf states are looking at this going, oops, we played the Assad card. The United States has a president who's kind of like, I don't want to be involved, and could have an incoming director of national intelligence who is an active Assad fan, which is kind of bizarre. The Iranians have got to be thinking, what do we do now? Similarly, the Russians, to just sort of pull the lens back a little bit And first, do you agree that it's a very fluid moment? And secondly, what do you think some of the predictable knock-on consequences are?
Yeah, well, I mean, unquestionably, the region was in a state of sort of dynamic flux before this happened in Syria. And the development in Syria has just blown it all up into the air. In large part because, and Marc knows this as well, Syria is the heart of the Middle East. What happens in Syria has never stayed in Syria, pre or post this crisis that began in 2011. And Syria as a state is capable of exerting an enormous influence, either, consciously and directly or indirectly, on a lot of what happens in the rest of the region. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from this recent development, despite the challenges associated with this group HTS that happens to be driving forward this transition, despite that, the most of the region, when you look at how Jordan, Saudi, Turkey, and many others across the region, why they intervened in Syria in the first place in 2011 and 2012, it was because they saw an opportunity to expel Iran from Syrian soil and completely transform what Syria represented geopolitically in the Middle East and further afield. Now, the reason why much of the region then flipped and turned towards normalizing Assad in the last 18 months or so was because they thought that goal was essentially unachievable through military means. And so they tried to do it with diplomacy, which, basically backfired. Now, finally, they have a total opening. Iran is the biggest loser out of all of the actors from Assad's fall. They have lost Aleppo and Damascus international airports. They've lost their land crossing with Iraq. They've lost all of their presence on major Syrian military bases. That is, a dagger into the jewel of the crown of Iran's regional agenda. And I think that's why we've seen this surge of Arab state government engagement with this group HTS in Damascus in the last 48 hours or so, is because they see this as an invaluable, unprecedented opportunity to reshape the Middle East and then push forward with Iran diplomacy, with Iran in a much weaker seat. Way weaker than it was after the recent war in Lebanon, way weaker than it was after the war in Gaza. This is a total game changer. And then just secondarily on Russia, I think personally, I still find it hard to believe that Russian troops will be able to stay on Syrian soil, given that those troops have been both indiscriminately but also precision targeting civilians since 2015. At the same time, I think the reason why they're still there has less to do with HTS and more to do with Turkey. Turkey likes the idea of balance. Turkey likes the idea that it won't and can't take on the entire weight of everything that happens in Syria. And in that sense, allowing the Russians to keep that foothold will allow it to play a bigger geopolitical game that keeps some hedging weight in terms of its relationship with Russia and its relationship with NATO and the United States. And I think that's where this Russian dynamic is much more. It's about much more than just Syria alone. But ultimately, as I say, I find it hard to believe that HTS or the Syrian people are going to allow Russia to stay on as a military player. And for me, the last thing is Israel, which I think is really the kind of wild card here. I totally understand. I don't necessarily support, but I understand that why Israel went after all of the military bases over the last few days, like 350 strikes in 48 hours. So I get it from their self-interested perspective. The land grab along the Golan is really, really escalatory. And in a time when everyone else in the international community is seeking to de-escalate the situation in Syria, the Israelis are doing the opposite. For now, all of these various armed groups in Syria are not paying attention to what Israel's doing because they too do not want to see another layer of hostilities develop on Syrian soil. But if Israel, or particularly, I should say, Netanyahu's government, keeps this kind of escalatory hardline rhetoric and action, I do really seriously think this could become a major distraction to what needs to be, a peaceful transition into a better and more stable Syria. So I know that the US has been sending at the highest levels warnings to the Israelis over the last couple of days to say, back off. Like, you are not helping.
Well, those have been super effective for the past year
so far. But I mean, it's better than us cheering them on, which I think would do a lot more damage. But yeah, I hear you. It's not helped until now.
So, Marc, as a final question here, I saw you. I don't know whether it was smile or roll your eyes or smile while rolling your eyes when I mentioned Tulsi Gabbard. We could have a director of national intelligence who is an active apologist for and fan of the war criminal Assad government. Does this series of events, which are likely to spill over well into next month when confirmations take place, have an impact on whether she will be confirmed? Does it make it harder? And should it?
Well, David, if we were talking about a normal set of circumstances with Republican senators who do have a sense of the kind of the national security of the United States, of course it should, but we don't have that. So look, I think that whether she gets confirmed or not has nothing to do with what she has done in the past. It's going to be just because the Republican senators are terrified of retribution. Now, one of the things that is interesting to me is not only her explanation of why she essentially took a trip at the behest of Syrian intelligence. I mean, let's just say what it is. But it's going to be, is there going to be, perhaps this is wishful thinking, but Syrian intelligence files, buildings, the Israelis have been bombing them, which is kind of annoying because I'd like to go see my old intelligence file. But ultimately,
they're making a new one for you here in this government. Sure. Yeah.
But ultimately, what does the Syrian regime think of that trip that they essentially sponsored? But perhaps that's wishful thinking. But no, of course, this should be a huge issue. She is totally unqualified and unsuitable in so many ways. And I know she'll be asked about this. I'm just not sure it's going to have any effect because it seems to me the senators, even the kind of the normal ones, national security minded, have kind of given up in terms of fear of retribution. It should be an issue. I hope the Democrats make it an issue and cause some discomfort as she makes the rounds on Capitol Hill. I'm sure people are asking her about this, but I don't think that it's going to cause any change of hearts for someone who a Republican senator who's going to get primaried. I think she's going to get in. I mean, amazingly enough, I think there's a chance that she does, and that is not good.
Well, certainly we'll make these conversations a lot more complex in the months and years ahead, and hopefully we will be able to continue them right here. For now, Charles, I know your schedule's been crazy busy. And thank you for coming out. We will come back and revisit this over the course of the weeks ahead. Marc, you do great work on Above Average Intelligence. I hope everybody listens to Above Average Intelligence. And Marc and all of his other media appearances, some of which are early in the morning. I really admire him for being able to get up and do that. I'm not as strong as you, Marc. And I would ask all of you to keep joining us here. We've given this a lot of coverage this week. We will continue to do so each and every day here at the DSR Network. Until then, be well. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.